Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 18th, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking ourselves first, are Russia's missile strikes really actually very strategic? Two, we're going to be asking ourselves if Russia's Ministry of Defense has actually just become its own worst enemy. Let's get into all of it right now. Okay, first and foremost, on the battlefield map, there are zero changes. Russia, despite all of its missiles and drones and everything else, has produced exactly zero battlefield outcomes. Again, we've talked about this. In Russian military doctrine, it would be devastating to deal such incredible blows to the headquarters, the main command of a military force. But thanks to, in part, NATO training on Ukrainian forces, but also I think in part just the motivation of Ukrainian forces and their own history of operating independently, there's actually doesn't appear to be that much disruption to Ukrainian forces' ability to continue the fight. This is, again, really quite important because right now when we look at the efforts of Russia, they are trying to create possibly outsized strategic effects, right? Disrupting command and control, disrupting logistics and supply. And for a Russian top-down style military, that would be the case. But when you have a military that is both driven by higher command, but also creates the expectation that subordinate commands also take action in the absence of orders and try to still fulfill the mission, you end up with very, very few disruptions. And we can see that here, right? Even as these devastating strikes rain down on Kiev, Ukrainian forces actually appear to make even marginal advances. I don't even know if these are advances per se. They may simply be repositioning, right? But you could see this. The only contested town is this Bichane, and it's not going to be contested for long. You can't. Whatever Russian forces are in there are going to have a rough go of it. When we look to the south, you could see pretty much the same thing. Very, very minimal changes in the last 24 hours. Minor adjustments, probably just repositioning or just clarification to data as we learn more about exactly what troops are positioned where and why. But when we look at the backfield, we can see this is not apparently where Russia still has strategic arsenals, strategic forces to deploy. Instead, we turn to Ground News. Ground.news is a great sponsor of this channel, and I love partnering with them because they let us see through the bias, disinformation, and misinformation by letting us get to the truth by comparing and contrasting all these different sources. I have a link in the description. Check them out for free with ground.news/combatveteran. Okay, Russia is hitting infrastructure targets across Ukraine, targeting power and water. Now, we've talked about this, about the efforts to deliver psychological damage to the enemy by, in Russia's case, the enemy Ukrainians, by targeting them, by bringing the war home, so to speak. Targeting civilian infrastructure, bringing munitions and warfighting not to military targets, but to civilian targets in an effort to diminish support for the war. This was done frequently in World War II, and it was found that it actually hardened the resolve, right? It made the war feel like not a theoretical concept, but an actual event that impacted people's lives. And once they felt like they were combatants in the war, they more heavily supported their own side. What exactly have they been targeting? Well, nearly 1/3 of Ukraine's power stations have been destroyed. You also have water and heating, and even the Ukrainian president's office has told Ukrainians to prepare for power, water, and heating to be cut off throughout the country. Now, why is this strategic? Well, we've talked about how Russia has a strategy in part of punishing European countries for their support for Ukraine. And they're doing that, of course, by cutting off the supply of natural gas and possibly creating catastrophic events that will spook the market and cause the price of liquid natural gas to spike ever higher. And the key is that these events are happening going into the European winter, right? When natural gas heating is going to be at its most essential. Well, this is that strategy on steroids, right? Now, Putin can only target European NATO countries through economic warfare, but it can target Ukrainians through, well, literal warfare. So that is why he is targeting power. He is targeting gas. He is targeting obviously electricity, communications, and water. The whole idea is to make this the most punishing winter for the Ukrainian people since World War II. Now, I suspect that it's possible this will almost certainly backfire, right? Because, again, takes the war home, makes the suffering feel real, and generally seems to harden people's resolve. There's also, hopefully, Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian civilians are better positioned to have some resilience in their infrastructure and simply their resilience in their lifestyle, right? This is the ability to heat their homes with potentially with firewood, potentially using water, using well water or filtered water, and you hope that NATO forces or NATO countries may be able to provide aid and support, right? Non-military aid and support to repair and maintain some of these facilities, to keep electricity on, even for just a few hours at a time, keep natural gas flowing, even for just a few hours at a time, even if it's just getting small, like natural gas heaters into the country. All of these things could potentially go a long way to making this much, much, much less punishing for Ukrainians. But either way, no matter what, whether you're a NATO country or a non-NATO country, Putin is doing his absolute best to make this winter one of the hardest in memory. And again, if you want my take on this, and you're going to get it whether you want it or not, there's a lot of times where, as countries, we find ourselves depending on authoritarian countries for things that we need. And a lot of people talk and harp about energy independence, but in situations like this, it actually becomes a strategic question. Again, does it mean more power generation inside NATO countries, right, through nuclear power plants or solar power or wind power, the ability to heat your homes with electricity, even in the U.S., right, where we subsidize a lot rooftop solar? I don't know. I think these are all part of a strategy of pivoting away from countries like Russia, like Saudi Arabia, that use the fact that they sit on oil reserves as a means to punish and manipulate their rival countries, European countries, the U.S., etc. Anyway, I also wanted to talk about the Russian Ministry of Defense's series of pretty embarrassing incidents. First off, let's talk about the this is a nice way of saying this. Institute for the Study of War called it a fratricidal altercation between mobilized servicemen at a training ground in Russia. This is, of course, what we sometimes call what we now know is a blue-on-blue incident, right, in which 15 Russian conscripts were killed at a range inside of Russia, where they were training to prepare to deploy to Ukraine. What's fascinating is that servicemen from Dagestan, Azerbaijan, and the Adigi region complained to their commander that the war in Ukraine is not theirs to fight, and the commander responded that they are fighting a holy war, and he called Allah a, quote, coward, unquote. This is going to cause a fight. This caused a fight to break out between Muslim and non-Muslim servicemen, and 3 mobilized Tajik servicemen opened fire at the training ground, killing the commander and both contract and mobilized soldiers. Eyewitnesses claim the shooters told Muslim servicemen to stand aside as they opened fire. What? Okay. this is one of the points. When I was deployed to Afghanistan, the U.S. Army spent a lot of time giving me what they called cultural sensitivity training. This is, of course, training on how to interact with other cultures in general, but specifically cultures in the Middle East, including Muslim norms, right? Cultural norms, linguistic and culinary norms, everything, so that you could interact and build a basic level of cooperation with people from a different culture than yours and different religious background. So obviously, even without that training, you would know that telling a Muslim that Allah is a coward is not going to go over well. This is a really bad idea. But what's more interesting is that, as they point out, the Kremlin's mobilization campaign has actually, I don't want to say targeted, but targeted ethnic minority enclaves who have borne the brunt of this, what they call forced generation efforts, or conscription and recruitment. And they've suffered substantial losses, right? We've talked about this, this is not a new trend. The Soviet military operated on kind of the same lines. Ethnic minorities, Tajiks, Azerbaijanis, Dagestanis, Chechens, even Ukrainians were treated as second-class soldiers, right? They were often discriminated against. Their battalions and formations would be sent on higher-risk missions, oftentimes with inferior equipment, to European Russians. And I mean, they're all European Russians. You know what I mean. Whatever. I don't know the name for the ethnic group of like Western Russia, but European Russians. And what happened, or what happens now, in order to survive in this, and the Russian military is just hostile, is just a hostile place. If you read any biography about a Russian conscript, they're going to tell you that the experience of being in there is that they're not a band of brothers. They never really develop really tight unit cohesion. There's so much hostility, especially in conscript units. Older conscripts will exploit, beat, physically, sometimes even sexually assault younger conscripts, right? And you would think literally 12 months of military service wouldn't make you think that you're an entirely different class of person. But it's a case of just you were brutalized as a conscript, you're going to brutalize others as a conscript. And the result is that oftentimes ethnic minorities will band together to protect one another and enforce, sort of stay inside their cultural norms. This is just a survival mechanism. And so when you have instance like this fratricide, it says that the Kremlin has still not, or the Russian Ministry of Defense is still not able to solve this core problem, not even of collaborating between another country, right? But even its own soldiers, they still don't have a basic protocol and a basic understanding of who exactly is showing up to engage in this combat and who exactly is Russian, right? If you are subject to conscription, you are Russian. And if you expect that 50% of your mobilized soldiers are going to be Muslim, then your commander should know how to engage respectfully with Muslim soldiers. That's just common sense. And the fact that the Kremlin has had literally 100 years to get this together and they haven't is a testament to just how dysfunctional the Ministry of Defense is. And we see, I'm not the only one who feels this way. Wagner Group's head, Prigozhin, is also dunking on the Russian Ministry of Defense. Obviously, as a power play for himself to grow the Wagner Group or possibly take over larger aspects of the whole conflict. We've talked about Wagner troops operating in Bakhmut, and he claims only Wagner troops are in Bakhmut. There's some rumors that the DNR forces are operating in the area as well. And he emphasized that he pays all the bills for the equipment for the troops, and also sometimes throws that equipment at Russian Ministry of Defense forces who are really hurting for equipment. Right, and even, a Wagner-affiliated Telegram channel is even said, commenting, noting that a quiet civil war is going on in Russia due to the Russian government's long-term inability, interesting, to restrict migration, presumably from Central Asian countries. This is fascinating because this sort of ethnic turbulence churning up, this is a characteristic of Russian disinformation efforts in other countries. They oftentimes will actually have Russian trolls take both sides of the debate, but push it towards extremes. And now they're taking that same playbook, possibly, and bringing it to Russia, trying to create an us versus them perspective, especially maybe trying to frame Prigozhin and his Wagner mercenaries as an effective fighting force when, in fact, the Russian Ministry of Defense is a host of ethnicities who are alien in various sorts, fighting one another. All right. Of course, this sort of talk is eaten up, is really red meat for Putin's nationalist constituency. Right? This is a nice way of saying the rabid pro-Russians that support the invasion. Russian ultra-nationalists is what we might call them. But ultimately, I think what we're seeing here is Prigozhin is trying his best to make a play to become the premier organizer of the fighting forces. I don't think he understands what he's signing up for. I think there's a tremendous difference between occupying a few dozen kilometers of a front line and recruiting prisoners and being able to run your own sort of little operation out with them, funding them for military equipment, and running an entire Ministry of Defense, right? Being able to recruit 3,000 to 6,000 prisoners is not the same thing as trying to run 300,000 conscripts through training and feed, organize, and prepare them for combat, especially when you have a situation like what we talked about, where your commander, where there's lots of ethnic conflict, but there's always been ethnic conflict in the Russian way of war. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. Hopefully you got some level of insight into the complete chaos that it seems to be blooming throughout the Russian war effort in the backfield, and an understanding of Putin's strategy. Let me know in the comments if there is anything else, any other news items you want me to address. And of course, thank you to Ground News for sponsoring today's video, and a big thanks to the patrons of Patreon. Again, I'm still on the road. I cannot shout you guys out, but I really appreciate it. And if you guys want to see my breakdowns of the most intense combat videos, Patreon is the place for it. I'll see you guys in the next one.